people were not self-sufficient. They needed each other. They relied on each other to provide for each other's needs. And so whether it was help with the butchering or all those types of things were things that the community did and that the neighbors did together. The front porch was a very active place in that time, right? And now today it's the decks on the back patio. What's gone from the front porch to the backyard has now gone to the internet.
Welcome, everyone, to Breaking Bread, the podcast brought to you by Apostolic Christian Counseling and Family Services. It's wonderful to have you along. In the studio today, I've got Amber Miller, who's no stranger here. Welcome, Amber.
Thanks, Matt.
And Tim Funk. Tim, this is your first time on.
Yes, it is.
Tim is our administrator. So great to have you on, Tim.
Thank you, Matt. Good to be here with you.
Today, we're going to talk about generations. So, Amber, why did the millennial cross the road?
Oh, boy.
I know.
I feel like I'm being set up for this.
You should just see her eyes of disdain of jokes of this manner. Because there's a lot of jokes out there, isn't there?
Oh, for sure.
I just made that up. I have no idea why the millennial crossed the road.
I'm just in suspense, yeah.
I don't know. My point is we throw around these terms of generations quite frequently, right? We all kind of know what that means. Oh, millennial or Gen X or baby boomer, right? But there's something really deep here. There's really something worth having a conversation about.
So I tend to work a lot with millennials and then the next generation below them, the Gen Z. And what I notice is that we can often be very misunderstood. And there's plenty of stereotypes and jokes, especially about millennials. And so it seems like it would be helpful to have a little bit of a discussion to maybe dispel some of those myths or just bring some understanding as to why certain generations tick the way they do.
But you're saying there's conflict in life, and some of that conflict, if you get down to the moorings, is generational ideals that are just different. And so maybe you're pitting maybe folks against their kids a little bit and saying,
right.
Okay, there's a disconnect here. There's frustration, and there's warranted frustration, but there's an explanation for the frustration.
Exactly.
Is that what you're saying?
For sure. There'll be plenty of situations where a parent or a support person doesn't understand why this younger person is behaving the way they are, or doing the things they're doing. You know,
so like the joke that I was playing right there, I mean, we do have jokes among the generations, and really they're catching nuances that everybody acknowledges, don't they? I mean, that's why the joke makes sense. So there is some nuances among the generations, but you mentioned there's some hurt. And there can be reason for misunderstanding, miscommunication. In very similar manner as you might travel to a foreign country. And Tim, you've done a lot of travel to foreign countries. You probably take some notes. Hey, what's the culture going to be like here? Because those things are meaningful. And you might just misinterpret something, miscommunicate something if you don't understand that culture. And am I far off by saying generations are like cultures?
Yeah.
They really are, yeah.
Tim is representing our baby boomers.
Yeah.
Amber's a millennial.
Yeah.
I'm a Gen X. So we have some perspective here, and let's just have a conversation a little bit about that and lay a little bit of a landscape, right? To give some understanding of, because when we understand maybe that culture, you see it for its beauty, which first comes off as odd. And then it's like, oh, okay. And then sometimes there's a reason behind some of that culture as well. So let's first start by maybe laying out the architecture of the generations, certainly the existing generations or the large playing generations today.
Sure. So just to give a bit of a snapshot here, when we talk about a generation, it really is looking at about a 15 to 20-year age range. And so the big generations that have really been studied and are most talked about today would be those people and was known as the silent generation, which is anyone that was born before 1945. The baby boomers make up a huge percentage of the U.S. population right now. And so those are people that were born between 1945 to 1960. And then Gen X, which is you, Matt, is more the early 60s to the 1980s, individuals born in that era. And then millennials, early 80s to mid 90s. And then the newest generation The Gen Z, which is reaching adulthood, newest generation to reach adulthood, I should say, is known as like the iGen or the Centennial generation. And they're just starting to do some research on alphas, which are kids that are about 10 years old or younger right now. So those are kind of the big players at this point in time. And of course, it is going to vary a little bit. People that are right in between a generation are maybe going to have features of both.
It's really fascinating that we are molded, aren't we? As much as we might not like it. So let me just use this. One time I was tying my tie, and I looked in the mirror and I realized this tie is really wide. In fact, this tie is as wide as the tie was in the family photos that I laughed at my dad for wearing. Right? When did I start to adopt wide ties? Somebody tricked me, right? 10 years before, I was laughing at it, and now that's what I'm pulling out of my closet. Mm-hmm. And I kind of looked up to the heavens and said, who is controlling my thoughts? You know what I'm saying? But there is this idea that we like to think we're kind of self-made people, but we're not. Would you say we're influenced? I mean, is that the bottom line there? I am influenced, and we're all influenced, and we're influenced by different things. What are the big influencers? So as we think about the boomers, what was the big influences in that generation,
Right.
Tim, that, like it or not, affected the psyche of boomers?
Right. So I'm at the tail end of the baby boomers, and so I start to bridge into the Gen X in my thinking as well, right? And so you can see the influences across there. But many of us were raised with the understanding of World War II. Mm-hmm. And that World War II happened, and a lot of the things that happened after World War II, and the frugality of the country, and there was respect, and there was, and then we started to see the advent of teenagers rising up, and we started seeing rock and roll come on the scene.
Right.
And so then we started to see things like technology. We started to see the Apollo landing of the moon, right? And that was an amazing thing. We saw a couple of presidents in our time be assassinated or attempted assassinations. Mm-hmm. So there was just a number of things that started to impact us, and some of the things that the shifts in the technology and that, and they're things that they happen, but you don't realize it's happening.
Yeah, there were these events that had an effect on you and on your generation. Amber, let's maybe just highlight some of those major events that somewhat define the generations, because I think that provides some helpful wherewithal to say, oh, that's what influenced me to the wide tie. You know what I'm saying? Speaking metaphorically here.
Yeah, so certainly if you look at the silent generation, it was shaped by the wars, and even their parents would have grown up through the Industrial Revolution, and so some of that influence started to impact them, and frugality and some of those dynamics there, where...
And the Great Depression not
exactly.
being the too far distant past, right?
Right.
I mean, there was no escaping that effect on life.
Right, and so all of a sudden you come out of like a World War II, and there's a boom in a lot of ways economically.
You know, I wonder if sometimes what affects us is the successes we have, right? You take the success of World War II, for example, and you come back home, that's got to shape your thinking on how business should look. Mm-hmm. I mean, after all, if we defeated the world evil by coming together and by falling in line and by having a clear leader and by doing your due diligence, I could see how that would trickle out into family life.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So then you do move into like the 60s and the 70s, which were a very turbulent time. And you see things like the Civil Rights Movement. You see things like Woodstock. You see Vietnam. I mean, just a lot of...
that pushback against that authority, maybe?
Exactly.
Is that fair to say?
Exactly. Yeah. And so you see like a product starting to arise from that time that really has an influence, the baby boomer generation that you were mentioning there, Tim. And so then that moved into like your generation, Matt. And so what do you think of the Gen X's?
Well, so in the Gen X, I do remember, when the Berlin Wall came down, that's formative, that was big, even though I was young enough to not totally understand what it meant. Some call Gen X the latchkey kids generation, right? Dad is working hard at his job. Mom now is maybe getting a job, right? Which was a bit of a different life family dynamic than previous generations, right? Kids were coming home and being raised by the television set and really have a lot of freedom. And here on our scene, we've got the computer that's really starting to make mainstay effect, right, with the Gen X's, right? I think we're called, digital immigrants. We weren't necessarily raised with it like our kids are today, but we adopted it pretty quickly and pretty easily. And so that whole technology piece makes a huge difference, right?
So then you do move into like millennials, and 9/11 certainly was very shaping for us. I remember being in school when that happened, and then also like Y2K. And we did grow up on screens in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. We grew up with computers and cell phones and having access to those things. And also I would say like diversity was so pushed in our generation. It seems hard to remember, hard to believe that the civil rights movement was just
a few decades back.
Right. And so I think there's a very different outlook from millennials on diversity and ethnicity.
Well, I think one of the things you saw, too, in at least in the times of the silent generation and the baby boomers, is you saw where ethnic groups would stay together. If you were Catholic, Catholics were Catholics, and the Methodists were Methodists, and so now you've had
neighborhoods were neighborhoods of ethnicity,
were Italian, or it was always, hey, you have your culture, you can certainly recognize, and you're kind to everybody, but this is your culture, and so you hold to these cultural practices and these things, and so. And then as I saw my children coming up, and they were raised alongside different races and different religious beliefs and different cultures where they come out of, and kids now are reaching across, and this diversity is being encouraged, and part of it out of necessity, and part of it out of just the desire for people to interact better and to team better in the workplace and things like that. Yeah. So you see that morphing over the generations.
That's interesting. Let me place my finger on something that I'm curious is a case here, and that is blind spots. Seeing things clearly and not seeing things entirely. Yeah. We have blind spots, and we have things we see clearly, and sometimes the divide between us kind of lies along those lines. So I kind of interrupted you, Amber, on the major influences. You mentioned 9/11 for millennials and those types of things. Why don't you fill the rest of it out in Generation Z then?
Yeah, and so then, we think about like the Great Recession that started to come in, and I would say that impacted a lot of millennials. And then you do move into Gen Z, which they have grown up in a world that has always gone through airport security. They know everything that is going on in the world because of the social media and news. And so every tragedy is reported upon. School shootings have been a thing for them. And so there's been like a very high level of anxiety, and that has started to emerge in the younger generations. And you think about just some of those things I mentioned.
So the question is, am I safe really comes to play for this youngest generation?
Yeah, it really starts to pop up. And it's a generation that has grown up in a fairly prosperous time. And so I think that's a big place where I see a difference, where an older generation looks on some of their kids or their grandkids and they wonder, why in the world are they anxious? Yeah. They have everything at their disposal, but they miss some of that piece where, 50 years ago, the only news they knew about was the local community news. They didn't know what was going on the other side of the world.
And now we know of every school shooting that occurs, right? And they are far too frequent. And just even to go into the amusement park, you have to turn over your bags and go through a metal detector in some places, right? That is impactful for this youngest generation.
Absolutely.
I think what's important is we realize while we can look at one generation and say, well, I can't believe that, we have to remember that we are a product of them or we are producing them. That's a very true statement.
Yeah. Another dynamic that I see too is sometimes almost like a paralysis that comes around decision making. And I've often wondered if it is simply because we have so many options and choices available to us today. Where, again, looking at an older generation, it was
So you're
pretty streamlined.
you're kind of speaking to your generation
Yeah.
when you're saying this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it was, hey, you grow up in a small community and you probably marry within that community and you probably
Find employment in that community.
find employment, buy a house there, where today it can feel like life is so unsettled. And if you want to move across the country, you sure could. Or if you want to go online and find a spouse, all of a sudden you're open up to thousands of possibilities where, again, it just can lead to this paralysis that happens because it's like, well, how do I even know how to make a decision? Because there's so many options in front of me.
So, Tim, does that, hearing the open options, does that strike a chord with you? And it's like, oh, yeah, that's...
It does, because as an old man, you look at this and you say, okay, we do have a ton of options today. And we see a ton of options within the family unit, a ton of options within the church, a ton of options within the community, right? And with options inherently comes this idea of commitment, and it goes against what I was raised up with, is that you commit to something. You commit to, if you go to work for a company, you're committed to that company, and the company's committed to you. And you have this, you go into marriage, and marriage is forever, and that's what it intended. And now today, these things are all options, right? And so, and yet according to Scripture, they're not.
Yeah.
So those are things that, for me, as I look at it as an older man, it's like, where is the commitment?
Where's the commitment? So let's just highlight that particular character quality. I think this very much mirrors the type of angst we have in the family across generations, right? This very, very character issue of commitment. Listen, so Amber, I'd love to hear you respond to that, because I'm guessing that perhaps there's an important lens to include if we're going to be talking about the character quality of commitment.
I think there's a element that we really prize in flexibility and freedom, and being able to have, again, not those deep roots in a certain place or in a certain possession or like a house or things like that, just because it could be gone. And we've maybe grown up watching some of our parents wrestle through that as divorce rates rise, or people did move or lose their homes or whatever that was. And so I think there's an element where it can be hard for our generation to commit and to really set down those roots. There can almost be a feeling of being trapped or suffocated. So I think some of it has been born out of watching what has unfolded in previous generations. And then some of it may be kind of a restlessness too, with just so many options in front of you and not really knowing what to do.
I think the choices is a key piece of that. I think there are, like you said, Amber, there's so many different choices out there today. I mean, this gets into an area that is maybe a little more delicate, but I never had to think about, was I born male or female?
Yeah.
And today, I mean, we're hearing things in the news about things that are just, they're earth-shaking to some of us, right?
Right.
And because one is we see them as totally counter-scriptural, but the other thing is it is a thinking of a generation.
So when we take this concept of, I think, commitment, I think is really interesting, because we can see how a couple of things are at play. Tim, you just mentioned previously about how homogeneous communities existed, right? And you explained, Amber, that diversity is experienced in the younger generations, right? Where that's not held as an ideal. Well, you can see how commitment, according to the older generation, might look like commitment to your people, and that means something. It means a neighborhood. It means a place of employment. I mean, we have all these circles, right? But as you've just described about diversity and opening up that world, the millennial might say, I'm not against commitment. I'm just committed to a larger world.
Right.
Is that a true statement?
Yes, absolutely.
So we can talk about commitment, and we can disagree with that application, but I think it's important that we kind of tease out what it is we're talking about here.
Exactly.
Because we can see how one thing compounds another when it comes to these generational shifts.
And I think the key thing, Matt, is that right now between Amber and I, between our generation is you. And so you can hear both of these things and you can help us understand each other. Right?
So here's what Gen X is. We're kind of like the middle child.
So
we're
true.
We are kind of like the middle child between two personality plus siblings. And so we just kind of hunker down and I don't know.
Let us fight it out.
But the interesting thing is the power of hearing each other, right? And for me to hear Amber explain that it's enriching, right? Yeah. It brings a richness to the discussion of where's your commitment, right? Mm-hmm. So that's that key to hearing each other.
Well, this is fun. Thanks for being along, everyone. We're going to cut into the conversation right now. We will be back at the next episode. We're going to continue to mine some of these nuances, some of these blind spots, some of these incongruencies that we have between the generations, and with the hopes that we might understand one another better. So thanks for being here on Breaking Bread. Have a great day.